Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Maybe because it was easier that way. Easier to laugh than to listen. Easier to pretend that one quiet voice couldn't matter when maps and orders already had their signatures stamped. Sergeant Elena Marquez sat near the edge of the room, notebook resting against her knee, pencil tapping in a slow rhythm that matched the pulse in her neck. Around her, the air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and stale coffee, Hellman's perfume, the one you never quite wash out. The projector hummed as the colonel dragged a laser pointer over the valley's contour lines, ridges, ravines, a few neat circles that meant objectives. On the screen, it all looked clean, predictable. But Elena's eyes didn't see neatness. They saw funnels. They saw angles. They saw what the maps refused to confess, the way the valley pinched near its mouth, how the high ground could swallow convoys whole. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough that the projector's whine almost drowned it. "Sir," she said evenly, "if those folds conceal anything heavier than rifles, our approach lanes will box us in." The colonel didn't look at her. He just shifted his stance, impatience flickering through his jaw. "Sergeant, track the equipment list. Leave tactics to staff." A few chuckles rippled through the rows of Marines. Not cruel exactly, just certain. Certain that this woman, the small one at the back, the one with the perfect range scores but no combat stories, had nothing worth saying. Elena closed her notebook. The pencil stopped tapping. Outside, the Afghan sun hung like a white wound in the sky. The compound buzzed with the everyday rhythm of war's waiting room, metal clanking in the motor pool, distant laughter from the chow line, the drone of generators. In that noise, nobody noticed the quiet figure crossing the yard with a rifle case slung over one shoulder. She found an empty stretch of shade near the wire, unrolled a tarp, and sat cross-legged. The rifle came out in pieces, bolt, barrel, stock, scope, each movement deliberate, exact. She didn't clean for ritual, she cleaned for memory. Every click of the bolt face, every cloth stroke through the bore was a way of reminding herself she still belonged somewhere, even if that place existed only between her and the weapon. Two lance corporals strolled by, laughing about something unimportant. Their eyes flicked toward her. One grinned. "There's the quota sniper." The other smirked. "Paper shooter. Good thing cardboard doesn't shoot back." They kept walking. Elena didn't respond. Her hands kept moving, steady, methodical. She had heard worse. Later in the mess hall, the pattern repeated. The scrape of chairs, the half glances, the practiced indifference that said you're tolerated, not trusted. She ate quickly, silently, spoon clinking against the metal tray. Around her, conversation filled every space except the one she occupied. That night when the compound quieted, she sat on her bunk with her notebook open beneath the red glow of a flashlight. The pages were crowded with lines, hand-drawn terrain profiles, ballistic drop charts, wind tables. Each number was a small rebellion. Every equation said what she couldn't. "I see what you don't." The notebook had become her real duty station. While others gambled or dozed, she mapped ridges, memorized distances, calculated crosswinds. She studied that valley long before the colonel's briefing. In her mind, it wasn't just topography. It was a riddle, one she knew would demand an answer sooner or later. Her father had taught her that kind of patience. Back in South Texas, before the Corps, before the uniform. He'd been a Marine once, two-tour, one shattered leg, a farm full of dust and silence afterward. He didn't talk much about war, but discipline seeped from everything he did. Chores at dawn, repairs before breakfast, lessons that had nothing to do with comfort. At dusk, he'd line up soda cans along the fence posts, hand her a worn hunting rifle, and say, "Steady breath. Let the shot surprise you." She learned early that control wasn't about strength. It was about stillness. By 12, she could drop every can in a single string. By 16, she was out shooting every ranch hand within 20 miles. When he died, heart attack, sudden, ordinary, she enlisted the next month. It wasn't grief that drove her. It was an unanswered question. Could she carry his discipline into the world he'd once belonged to? She could, she did. She earned her sniper qualification in a class where nobody expected her to last a week. She survived the sleep deprivation, the endless crawl drills, the punishing precision tests. Her scores were immaculate, her reputation invisible, because paper doesn't bleed, they told her. And she, who knew the truth of that more than anyone, stayed silent. Now, years later, that silence was the only thing she trusted. Words had become currency too cheap to spend. The orders came down 2 days after that briefing. 480 Marines, her battalion, would move into the valley she already feared. Reinforced, resupplied, confident. Command called it a stabilization sweep. Routine. Routine, the word made her skin tighten. When the convoys rolled out, engines growling like restless animals, Elena stood by the gate with her clipboard and radio log. The dust followed them until they vanished into the horizon's haze. She should have been relieved to stay behind, safe inside the wire, exactly where they wanted her. But safety had never felt so wrong. In the operations room, the atmosphere was casual. Screens flickered with drone feeds. Radios crackled with convoy reports. Everything looked normal, until it didn't. The first silence came small, a missing check-in, then two at once, then a clipped voice breaking through static, contact, contact. The room froze. A watch officer repeated the word as though saying it softer would change its meaning. On the drone monitor, white smoke blossomed along the ridges. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning. Someone reached for a checklist. Someone else whispered, "Protocol says wait." The colonel's voice grew tight. "Hold position, too hot for air support." Elena stood near the back, heart pounding not from fear but recognition. She knew this geometry. She'd drawn it in her notebook 100 times. Now it was alive and eating the battalion whole. She watched the feed, Marines scrambling for cover behind smoking vehicles, the kill zone tightening, machine guns on the high ground stitching the earth with precision. A phrase echoed across the radios, "Hold position." Hold while men bled into the dust. Hold because the rulebook couldn't imagine this valley's teeth. Elena's hand found the zipper of her rifle case. Her fingers trembled, not with doubt but with the pressure of choice. She obeyed every order, swallowed every dismissal. But now, 480 names depended on someone refusing silence. "Too hot," a major said again. "No air within 200 meters. We wait for them to break contact." "They can't break," Elena said quietly. The colonel half turned. "Sergeant, you're not cleared to speak." "It's not clearance, sir, it's math." Her voice didn't rise, but something in it carried through the room. "I can cut the anchors, the nests on the eastern spur. If they fall, the line collapses." Laughter thin and nervous. "You'll save a battalion with a scoped opinion," someone muttered. She didn't answer. She zipped the case open. Metal and glass caught the light. A first sergeant near the door bristled. "Where are you going with that?" "Out." Nobody moved to stop her. Maybe they didn't believe she'd really go. Maybe they were grateful someone else would bear the weight of defiance. She stepped into the sunlight. The heat hit like a wall. Her helmet hung low, shadowing her eyes. She could feel her father's dog tag tapping softly against her chest, his name nearly rubbed away. The rhythm steadied her. The ridge ahead rose sharp against the sky. That's where she needed to be. From there she could see the valley's mouth, the arcs of fire, the patterns of death. Her boots sank into loose gravel as she climbed. Every breath rasped through the dust. Her muscles burned, but her mind stayed cold. She counted steps the way she once counted heartbeats between shots. 100 meters. 2. 3. The world narrowed to effort and silence. Above her, the sun glared without mercy. Below, the sound of war grew louder, the rattle of rifles, the thump of explosions, the radio's distant cries. She reached the crest at last, dropped flat, and unfolded the bipod. The M40 settled into the dirt like it belonged there. Through the scope, chaos took form. The battalion pinned in the open, trapped between crossfires. The eastern spur there. A machine gun nest, tucked into a crease of rock, spitting fire into a ravine where Marines crawled for cover. Elena exhaled slowly. The reticle steadied. She felt the world narrow to a single heartbeat, a single thread of wind curling left to right. The shot broke the silence like a secret being told. The machine gun fell silent, one burst gone, one breath bought. She worked the bolt without thought. The next target moved into view, an RPG team setting up for a shot at the wounded convoy. Her finger found the trigger again. The second shot erased them before the rocket could fly. Voices erupted on the net. Confusion, disbelief. Who's firing? Do we have air cover? She ignored them, moved 3 meters to shift her angle, crawled low. The rocks scraped her sleeves, pulling the fabric high enough to expose the tattoo on her forearm, the Marine sniper emblem, ink faded but proud. She wasn't supposed to exist anymore, not in this unit. But ghosts have a way of showing up when the living run out of answers. Her rifle spoke again, and again, each shot a small correction in the universe, each silence that followed a life reclaimed. Down below, Marines began to move, not with panic but with purpose. Someone shouted over the net, something, cutting them off. We've got cover. In the command room, they were staring at the screens now. The colonel silent, the major pale. The feed showed muzzle flashes disappearing, one after another like lights being snuffed. Elena stayed prone, steady, unseen. The dust stung her eyes, but she didn't blink. This was what she'd been waiting for, not glory, not redemption, just the simple convergence of preparation and necessity. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her mind, steady breath. Let the shot surprise you. The valley began to shift. The trap was unraveling, and still she didn't speak, didn't radio, didn't announce herself. Sometimes command doesn't come from authority, it comes from precision. What she didn't know, what no one in that valley could yet see, was how fast fear could change shape. A minute ago, 480 Marines had been dying quietly inside their radios. Now, across that frequency, confusion was turning into hope. Who's got Overwatch? Someone demanded. No one answered, no one knew. Elena's cheek rested against the stock. Sweat ran down her temple, catching dust and turning it into mud. She shifted her breathing, shallow and timed with the rhythm of her pulse. The crosshairs floated, steadied, settled again. Another burst from the ridge opposite. She traced it, followed the muzzle flash back to its source and fired. The gun fell silent. A heartbeat later, another flash appeared, slightly lower, slightly closer. She adjusted 2 clicks right, half a breath, another pull. The sound came soft through the suppressor, almost polite, but the effect was not. Down below, movement rippled through the trapped Marines. Heads lifted. Orders regained shape. A squad scrambled to retrieve wounded brothers. The kill box that had seemed sealed was cracking open. She crawled forward, dragging her body over shale, the rifle tight against her chest. Her elbow caught a sharp edge, tore her sleeve wider. She barely noticed. Her eyes stayed in the scope, hunting the next problem. In the command post, they were frozen in a different kind of disbelief. The colonel's face was unreadable, eyes locked on the drone feed where muzzle flashes vanished one by one. A young lieutenant whispered, "Sir, someone's engaging from the near ridge." The colonel's lips pressed into a line. No air assets are in range. Then it's no one, the colonel cut in. No one authorized. But the word no, one didn't fit what the screens were showing. The major leaned closer to the monitor, voice dry. Whoever it is, they're good. Good wasn't the word. What the drone saw was precision bordering on unnatural. Each shot landed where geometry said it shouldn't. Targets shielded by rock simply stopped moving. Enemy formations that had looked untouchable began to dissolve. Back on the ridge, Elena's breath misted the edge of her scope. She licked dry lips, shifted, recalculated. Wind quartering left to right 800 meters at just 0.6 mil. Her finger tightened, paused. The rifle bucked gently. Another flash disappeared. Her world was a tunnel of glass and heartbeat. She didn't feel the ache in her shoulders anymore or the sting in her scraped forearms. Only rhythm, only the sound of breath meeting purpose. Below, the Marines were shouting again, voices half incredulous, half reborn. "We've got a ghost on Overwatch," someone yelled. Ghost? The word traveled fast. In every platoon, every squad. It carried like static across frequencies until even the pinned units at the valley's far end had heard it. "There's a ghost up there. Somebody's covering us." On the radio, a familiar gravel voice broke through, the SEAL commander attached to the battalion. "Call sign check. Who the hell's firing cover?" Elena ignored it. She shifted angles again, crawling toward a better sightline on the western spur. The valley spread below her like an open wound. The sun had begun to lower, bleeding gold over the dust. Shadows stretched long, and with them came new dangers, moving shapes harder to read, harder to predict. She found one, a team dragging a mortar tube up the slope. If they set it, the corridor she was building would close again. She calculated, adjusted, breathed, fired. The mortar slid back down the hill, lifeless hands still clutching it. Then through the radio static, a name she hadn't heard in months. Phantom 7, confirm position. Her heart stuttered. For a second she froze, finger hovering above the bolt. No one had called her that since sniper school. No one in this battalion was supposed to even know it. "Phantom 7, the commander repeated. "Is that you?" She hesitated, staring at the valley through her scope. That call sign had once been her entire identity, back before politics had buried her under support rosters and logistics duties, back when skill still meant trust. Now the name hung in the air like a ghost, refusing to stay dead. The net went silent. Every Marine listening knew that call sign. They'd heard stories in sniper school about impossible distances, confirmed hits that shouldn't have been possible. Phantom 7 was legend, myth, a rumor that lived between deployments. "Wait," someone said softly over the comm. "That's Marquez, Phantom 7's her." The commander didn't respond right away. Then his tone changed, firm, respectful. "Copy that. Phantom 7, hold your lane, keep carving, we're moving." For the first time that day, authority bent toward reality. Elena didn't answer, she didn't need to. The rifle did the talking, shot after shot, deliberate, surgical. The ridge shook with return fire now. The enemy had realized what was happening. Sniper glints flared like lightning across the opposite slope. Dust kicked up inches from her head. A bullet hissed so close it parted a strand of her hair. She pressed herself into the earth, heartbeat calm, eyes unblinking. Find their angle, break it. She counted the rhythm of their fire, traced the delay between bursts, and found the glint again. This one came from behind a half-buried truck carcass, nearly invisible except for the faint shimmer of glass. She exhaled slower than the wind, fired. The counter-sniper's scope winked out like a dying star. Her hand trembled as she worked the bolt. She told herself it was adrenaline, but part of it was something deeper, a strange, aching clarity. The same feeling she'd had as a child on her father's farm when the world shrank to a fence line, a target and breath. Only this time, lives hung in the space between inhale and exhale. She crawled 3 meters left to avoid triangulation, rolling behind a slab of stone. Her chest burned. The dog tag tapped against her armor with every breath, steady as a metronome. In the valley below, the SEAL commander was moving with his men, guiding squads toward the extraction corridor she'd opened. The sound of rotor blades was faint at first, like wind whispering in a metal shell. Then louder, then undeniable. Helicopters. Elena watched them crest the ridges, dust exploding in halos around them. Marines lifted their heads, disbelief turning to desperate hope. The first bird dropped into the clearing she'd carved with her shots. First chalk is down, a voice shouted over the comms. Second inbound. The commander's tone cracked for the first time all day. Phantom 7, keep them off our flanks. Elena's reply was a breath, a thought, and another shot. A gunner lunging toward the landing zone folded mid-stride. Another tried to line up an RPG, fell before his finger found the trigger. The rhythm became instinct. Scan, aim, breathe, fire, cycle. Again, again. The valley's chaos slowly bent toward order. Marines dragging wounded. Medics shouting for stretchers. The sound of gunfire thinning. And beneath it all, a strange silence grew, not absence but awe. In the command center, the colonel finally spoke, voice quiet as if afraid the walls might remember. She disobeyed a direct order. The major swallowed, yes, sir. She saved the battalion. No one answered. There was nothing left to say. Back on the ridge, Elena's cheek throbbed where the rifle stock had pressed too long. Her shoulders ached. Her throat was raw from the dry air. But she stayed prone, covering every bird until the last one lifted clear of the valley floor. As the final helicopter rose, its downdraft swept dust over her, stinging her eyes. She blinked hard, lowering her rifle at last. Her muscles refused to relax. The echo of each shot still lived in her bones. For a long time she just lay there, watching the empty valley. The sun was gone now, replaced by the dull red wash of dusk. Smoke curled upward in thin, tired ribbons. The ground below looked less like a battlefield and more like a confession, evidence of everything silence had cost. She reached into her pocket, found her notebook, flipped it open with trembling fingers. On the first blank line she wrote 4 words, 0 left behind today. The pencil snapped halfway through the last letter. She didn't replace it. She just closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and breathed. By the time she reached the compound again, the night was deep. Floodlights threw long shadows over the dirt. The air smelled of fuel and blood and something else, something softer. Respect, maybe. Marines stood in lines along the path. No laughter now, no mockery, just silence and the faint rustle of uniforms as they came to attention, helmets under arms, eyes lowered. Elena walked past them, boots whispering through the dust. Her face was streaked with grime, her uniform torn, but her stride never faltered. At the end of the line stood the colonel. His posture rigid, regulation perfect, but his eyes looked human for the first time. "You disobeyed direct orders," he said. "Yes, sir." "You saved them." She didn't answer. The silence between them said everything. Behind him, the SEAL commander stepped forward, saluted sharply. "Phantom 7, he said, voice steady but thick, "the valley owes you." She returned the salute, slow, deliberate. Not pride, not defiance, just acknowledgement. Then she turned, rifle slung, and walked toward the armory. Inside, she stripped it down piece by piece, cleaned it, logged every round, wrote every distance. Outside, the compound was still. Inside, her heartbeat was steady. Because sometimes victory isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand to be seen. It just breathes quietly in the aftermath, counting the cost of doing what was right. And as she closed her notebook for the last time that night, one truth wrote itself in the silence. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to wait. She woke before dawn, not because of alarms, but because her body had forgotten how to rest. The world was still tinted in that blue-gray haze that makes everything look suspended, the hour between night and morning when war camps sound like ghosts breathing. Elena lay still on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of generators and the distant clatter of boots. Her hand still remembered the weight of the rifle. Her shoulder still felt the echo of recoil, every tendon holding a fragment of yesterday. She blinked slowly, and for a second she could still see the valley, the muzzle flashes, the shapes falling, the corridor of dust that had turned into survival. Then the intercom cracked. "All command personnel, report to debrief at 0600. She swung her legs off the bunk. Her boots were still caked in dirt. She didn't bother brushing it off. The mirror above the sink caught her reflection, hollow-eyed, jaw-tight, streaks of grime like old paint. Her face didn't look heroic. It looked tired. She splashed water over it, the chill biting her awake, and tied her hair back. The dog tag at her chest clinked once against the metal rim of the sink. Outside, the compound buzzed with a new kind of noise, not laughter, not chatter, but the low hum of awe trying to disguise itself as routine. Marines moved slower, quieter. Conversations hushed when she passed. Some nodded. Most looked away, not out of disrespect, but because they didn't know how to look at her now. In the mess hall, Spoons paused midair. A private near the end of the line whispered something to his buddy. The word phantom slipped through the air like static. She ignored it, collected her tray, ate in silence. The debrief room was brighter than usual, sunlight slicing through the high windows and cutting sharp angles across the floor. The colonel sat at the head of the table, expression unreadable. The SEAL commander stood beside him, arms crossed, uniform still smudged with dust. Elena took her seat at the far end, back straight, hands folded on the table. The colonel began without preamble. "Yesterday's engagement resulted in 0 fatalities," he said, voice flat but strained. "Given the circumstances, that's statistically impossible." The room was silent. Maps lay unrolled on the table, marked with red X's where the ambush had first lit up. He continued, "We've reviewed the drone footage. The Overwatch position on the northern ridge neutralized 12 heavy weapon nests, 3 RPG teams, and multiple command relays. Whoever was behind that rifle," his eyes flicked toward her, "violated engagement protocols, perimeter orders, and direct command." The words landed heavy but not cruel. They were procedure talking, not resentment. The SEAL commander spoke next. "Sir, with respect, if she hadn't, you'd be reading casualty numbers instead of coordinates." The colonel didn't argue, he just exhaled through his nose. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" the SEAL pressed. "Because from where I was standing, she saw what none of us did, and she acted when none of us could." The colonel's jaw worked, searching for ground between law and truth. He looked at Elena. "You understand, Sergeant, that command disobedience in the field is a court-martial offense." "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do it?" Her voice came quiet but steady. "Because I calculated wrong, sir." The room shifted, the colonel frowned. "Explain." "I thought I could live with silence." Her fingers traced the grain of the table. "I thought doing what I was told was the same as doing my duty. But when I heard those radios go dead, I realized I'd been hiding behind procedure. The rules said wait. The math said act." The SEAL commander's eyes softened. The colonel's gaze lowered for a heartbeat. Silence stretched until it broke under paperwork and duty. "You'll receive a formal review," the colonel said at last. "Until then, you're confined to base. No further field deployment." "Yes, sir." He dismissed them with a nod. Outside, the sunlight had turned harsh. The compound looked unchanged, but something in the air had shifted, like the world knew it owed her something but couldn't decide what. By noon, the story had spread beyond the valley. Headquarters had sent encrypted inquiries. Someone in intelligence wanted her range data. Someone else wanted to verify whether the Phantom 7 call sign was operational again. By evening, the battalion's rumor mill was working overtime. Some said she'd been a legend erased by politics. Some said she'd disobeyed orders for revenge. Others said she wasn't real, just a ghost conjured by desperation. Elena stayed in the armory away from all of it. She sat at her workbench, rifle stripped, parts lined in perfect symmetry. The smell of solvent filled the air. Her fingers moved mechanically. Brush, cloth, bolt, barrel, again and again. She wasn't cleaning the weapon anymore, she was cleaning the noise out of her mind. A knock on the door broke the rhythm. "Come in." It was the SEAL commander. He stepped inside holding 2 mugs of coffee, Mind if I sit? She nodded once. He lowered himself onto the crate opposite her, leaned forward, elbows on knees. You don't look like someone who just saved a battalion. I don't feel like someone who did. Then how do you feel? Like someone who disobeyed orders. He smiled faintly, no humor in it. Every war's been won by someone who did. They sat in quiet for a while, the hum of the air conditioner filling the space. Finally, she said, "You were on the ground, you saw it. Did anyone make it out that shouldn't have?" He shook his head. "No, we brought everyone back. You didn't just give us shots, you gave us time we didn't have." Her eyes dropped. "That time cost something." "Everything costs something," he said softly. "Question is, was it worth the price?" She didn't answer. She didn't know how to measure worth anymore. He stood, set the empty mug on the table, and hesitated at the door. Phantom 7, that name, been around longer than either of us. It means precision, discipline, no wasted motion. You lived it yesterday. Whether they honor it or bury it again, that's their choice. But it's yours to carry. After he left, the silence felt heavier. She finished cleaning the rifle, logged the data, and closed the notebook. On the back cover, she ran her thumb over a faint scratch, one her father had carved years ago. "Duty is not obedience," it read. "It's accuracy." That night the dreams came, fragmented, colorless. Muzzle flashes blooming in darkness. The sound of her father's voice, whispering through static. The weight of all the faces she hadn't seen but had saved. She woke at 300, sitting upright, hand reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. Her throat was dry. She crossed the room, opened her notebook again, and began to write, not data this time, but thoughts. "They called me Phantom today. I thought that name was dead. Maybe it still is. Maybe that's the point." Her handwriting wavered as fatigue pulled at her. "I don't know if I did the right thing. I only know that silence felt wrong." The next morning, when she stepped outside, the sky was the pale color of sand and ash. The compound moved in disciplined silence, but there was something different in the way people stood when she passed, a subtle straightening, an unspoken salute. A young Marine near the armory broke formation, jogged toward her, then hesitated. He was barely 20, freckles still visible beneath the grime. "Ma'am," he stammered, "I just wanted to say I was in Bravo. You covered us." She nodded once. "I just did my job." He shook his head. "No, ma'am, you did what none of us could." She watched him go, his helmet bouncing against his pack, his steps lighter than they'd been yesterday. For the first time, she felt something close to peace. Not pride, not victory, just a quiet understanding that maybe the act of saving lives was enough, even if nobody knew what it cost her. That night, when the generators dimmed and the stars came out, she sat by the fence line again. The rifle rested across her knees, its steel catching the faint light. Beyond the wire, the desert stretched infinite. Somewhere out there, the valley lay still, emptied of gunfire but full of memory. She whispered into the dark, voice barely audible. "You'd have done the same, wouldn't you, Dad?" The wind didn't answer, but it carried the smell of dust and something almost like home. And as she sat there, the silence around her didn't feel like dismissal anymore. It felt like acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need applause or medals or names etched in stone. Because sometimes silence is what hides you. It's what keeps you whole. The letter arrived 3 days later. No signature, just a seal pressed into brown paper that looked older than the words it carried. She'd known it was coming. Command always moved fast when someone broke the rule book, even if they broke it to save lives. She sat on the cot in her quarters, sunlight bleeding through the canvas window, the envelope heavy in her hands. The words were formal, detached. "You are hereby ordered to appear before the Review Board, Kandahar Base, for assessment of conduct and field protocol deviation." In simpler language, a judgment. Elena folded the letter carefully, slid it under her notebook, and sat still for a long time. Outside, engines coughed awake. Marines moved in disciplined lines, and somewhere down the compound, someone laughed, short, nervous, guilty. She couldn't blame them. The story of the sniper who disobeyed had grown too large to fit inside the walls anymore. It had traveled faster than mail, through satellite comms, through rumor, through whispers that reached even headquarters. Some said she'd ignored orders because she didn't trust command. Others said she'd acted on instinct, that no algorithm or satellite could match what she'd seen through her scope. A few said she got lucky. None of them were entirely wrong. At dusk, she cleaned her rifle again, not out of superstition, but because the ritual steadied her. Every part fit into her palm like something meant to be there. Every click and turn erased noise. A voice came from the doorway. "You're still awake." She didn't look up. "You're still here." The SEAL commander leaned against the frame, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the half-light. "They'll make you answer for it." "I know. You'd do it again, wouldn't you?" She paused, tightening the bolt. "If the math stayed the same, yes." He nodded slowly. "Good, that's what makes you dangerous." She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Dangerous." To the kind of people who prefer procedure over truth. He stepped inside, his boots soft against the floor. "They'll ask if you thought you were above command. Tell them no. Tell them you were beneath it, down where the bullets hit and the decisions matter." She gave a small nod. "I don't need advice, Commander." "I know, but you might need someone to remind you that the ones who survived, they're waiting to speak for you." When he left, the air felt heavier, as though even silence had begun to anticipate what was coming. The next morning, a convoy took her to Kandahar. The desert unrolled outside the window like an unfinished painting, wide, empty, indifferent. She watched the horizon, her reflection flickering faintly in the glass. Inside her vest pocket, her father's dog tag tapped a steady rhythm. It was the only sound she trusted. At headquarters, the world felt different. Cleaner, colder. The air smelled of paperwork and coffee instead of dust and fuel. The hallways echoed with clipped footsteps and voices practiced in formality. When she entered the review chamber, 3 officers sat behind a polished table, 2 colonels and a brigadier general. Their faces were carved from the same mixture of age, duty, and fatigue. "Sergeant Marquez," the general began, "you understand the nature of this inquiry." "Yes, sir." He studied her a moment. "You disobeyed a direct order, crossed the perimeter, and engaged without authorization. Do you deny that?" "No, sir." "Then this review isn't about what you did. It's about why." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Because waiting would have killed them. According to protocol, you were to maintain comms and await support. Support wasn't coming, not in time." The older colonel leaned forward, voice skeptical. "You believed your judgment outweighed that of your commanding officers." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't believe anything. I measured. The data was wrong. The valley geometry trapped them. I had the coordinates, the wind, the angles. The difference between obeying and losing 480 Marines was math. I just solved it." The general's eyes flickered, not with anger, but with something more complicated, respect hidden behind duty. "You realize," he said softly, "if everyone acted on instinct, there would be chaos." "Yes, sir, but if no one does, there's only tragedy." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful, heavy. They dismissed her an hour later. "You'll be informed of the board's decision." Outside, she stood in the bright sun, the air almost too still. The convoy that had brought her waited by the gates. Before climbing in, she turned once toward the headquarters building, a block of concrete that contained the power to erase or define her entire career. Then she looked away. Back at Helmand, the compound felt smaller, or maybe she'd grown beyond it. The Marines greeted her differently now. Some nodded, some saluted. Some still avoided her eyes as if afraid that looking at her might demand courage they weren't ready to hold. In the mess hall, a young sergeant approached her table. "Ma'am, I was on the East Ridge that day. My squad," he stopped, swallowed. "We thought we were dead. Then the fire just stopped. I saw the nest collapse. I saw you." She shook her head slightly. "You didn't see me. You saw precision." He smiled faintly. "Whatever it was, it kept my brothers alive. Thank you." After he left, she sat for a long time, spoon untouched in her bowl. The gratitude hit harder than the insults ever had, maybe because it carried the weight of survival. That night she wrote again. "They think the fight is over, but I can still hear it. Every sound, every breath between shots. I used to think duty was following orders. Now I think it's listening to the voice that doesn't shout, the one that warns you before the maps catch up." She closed the notebook, set it beside her rifle, and let her eyes fall shut. Sleep came in fragments again, flashes of muzzle fire, a hand reaching, the soft thump of rotors lifting men to safety. In the dream, she stood on the ridge again. Only this time, when she looked through the scope, she saw her own reflection staring back. The days passed slowly after that. The board's decision didn't arrive. Maybe they didn't know what to do with someone who disobeyed for the right reason. The SEAL commander stopped by often. He'd bring coffee, sometimes silence. They never talked about the valley, not directly. They didn't need to. It lived behind their words. One evening, as the sun burned low and the horizon turned molten, he asked, "What'll you do if they cut you loose?" She thought about it. "I don't know. I've been in this uniform so long, I'm not sure who I am without it." "You're the reason we all made it back," he said simply. "If they take your stripes, they can't take that." She gave a small, tired smile. "Metals fade, memory doesn't." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of fuel and sand. He stood, adjusted his gear. "You know," he said, glancing at her rifle, "most snipers I've met, they talk about kill counts. You never have." "I don't count kills," she said quietly. "I count silences." He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. When he left, the stars came out one by one. She sat by the wire, tracing the dog tag with her thumb. The metal was worn, almost smooth now, the letters fading like old prayers. Somewhere beyond that horizon, men were still alive because she hadn't waited. That was enough, or it had to be. On the seventh night, the radio in her quarters crackled to life. "Sergeant Marquez, report to command." She stood slowly, the sound of her boots soft on the floor. In the briefing room, the colonel and the SEAL commander were waiting. Between them, a single sheet of paper lay on the table. The colonel looked up. "The review is complete." Her heartbeat didn't quicken. She'd already made peace with both possible futures. "You're officially cleared of insubordination," the colonel said, voice low. "The board ruled your actions operationally justified under duress." He paused, a rare flicker of humanity in his tone. "They don't know what to do with heroes who break rules, so they just don't name them." The SEAL commander smiled faintly. "That's all right. The ones who matter already know her name." Elena nodded, exhaled softly. The tension that had lived inside her for weeks began to unravel. "Sir," she said quietly, "may I request reassignment?" The colonel blinked. "Reassignment?" "To the front, any unit that still needs eyes on a ridge." The SEAL commander grinned. "Careful what you ask for. Ghosts tend to get called back when the night gets dark." She smiled for the first time, small, tired, but real. "Then I'll stay where it's darkest." The colonel didn't object. He just nodded once, slow, like he understood something beyond the file in front of him. Outside, the night wind carried the faint thrum of distant choppers. Somewhere, another valley waited, another equation unsolved. Elena walked back to her quarters, unbuckled her vest, and set her rifle on the cot. The dog tag swung once, glinting in the dim light. In her notebook, she wrote only one line before turning off the lamp. Sometimes protocol builds walls, but courage builds corridors. And as she lay back, listening to the hum of the compound, she realized something simple. The war might never end, but neither would the quiet kind of bravery that refuses to be seen until the world needs it most. Because some soldiers fight for glory, some fight for survival, and a few fight for accuracy, to set things right when everything else is wrong. The rotor wash whipped sand into the air, stinging her face like fine rain. The helicopter dipped low, its shadow sliding over the desert floor like a restless memory. Elena sat near the door, headset pressed tight, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her gear rattled softly with each tremor of turbulence. The crew chief beside her gave a thumbs up, not a greeting, just habit. Nobody spoke much on rides like these. This was her reassignment. Forward observation and recon deep field. No formal briefing, no ceremony. Just a call sign, a location, and a seat on the first transport out. That's how ghosts travel. Below, the land was endless, scarred with wadi cuts and burned-out husks of old armor. The desert had the patience of God, it forgot nothing. The chopper banked left, and for a moment she saw the mountains far to the north, blue silhouettes rising out of haze. Somewhere beyond them, a new operation waited. The commander's words echoed in her head, "Careful what you ask for. Ghosts get called back when it's dark." He'd been right. They landed on an improvised pad carved from gravel and discipline. Camp Relic, they called it, an outpost straddling a valley mouth that looked too quiet for comfort. Dust coated everything, including the faces of the Marines who greeted her with the cautious curiosity reserved for legends they didn't yet believe in. A sergeant jogged forward, "You Phantom 7. She hated the name already. "Sergeant Marquez," she corrected, unclipping her helmet. He nodded quickly, uncertain. "Right. Command's expecting you at the Overwatch Tower." The outpost was smaller than Helmand, 2 rows of tents, 1 comms shack, and a cluster of sandbag walls that pretended to be safety. The air shimmered with heat. Every sound carried, boots, metal, the dry cough of the generator. As she walked through camp, conversation ebbed. Eyes followed her, not hostile, not mocking, just measuring. Soldiers whispering behind hands, trading half-stories they'd heard from others. "That's her, right. Phantom 7, the sniper from the valley." "No way, thought that was just a myth." "Myth doesn't carry a rifle that clean." She ignored them. Legends were armor for people who needed heroes. She wasn't here to wear armor, she was here to work. At the tower, a lieutenant waited, too young for the weight on his shoulders, too polished for this much dust. "Sergeant," he said, offering a tight smile. "Heard you were reassigned to my AO." "Yes, sir." "Good to have you. Intel's been twitchy, movement near the ridgelines. Nothing confirmed." He gestured toward the scopes lined against the railing. "We've been blind for days." She followed his gaze to the horizon. The valley stretched outward like a half-buried scar. The ridges were distant enough to lie and close enough to kill. "I'll need maps," she said. He blinked. "Maps? I don't trust screens. Paper doesn't lose signal." He nodded slowly, gesturing to a private to fetch them. When she spread the maps across a crate, she marked the folds with a pencil: terrain gradients, wind funnels, line-of-sight corridors. The others watched, half curious, half impatient. "This sector," she said, tapping a finger against the contour lines, "has a saddle that funnels wind at dusk. Anyone using it could shoot down into the camp without shifting position." The lieutenant frowned. "You think they're preparing an attack?" "I think they're watching," she said simply. "And the only thing more dangerous than an enemy you can see is one that hasn't blinked yet." By dusk she was on the ridge. She'd gone out alone against polite suggestions, carrying her M40, rangefinder, and a small pack. The climb was brutal, loose shale, long slopes, the dry rasp of wind whispering through her mask. Every step felt like memory repeating itself. At the top, she dropped to her stomach and scanned the valley through her scope. Nothing. Just stillness. But stillness had a sound. She could hear it, that low hum that wasn't quite silence, that space between intention and action. She adjusted focus, waited, counted breaths. Then movement, a flicker of reflection on the far ridge, too controlled to be random, a scope glint. Her pulse didn't quicken, it slowed. She dialed elevation. 800 meters, crosswind 4 knots from left to right. She exhaled, steady. Through the glass, she saw the outline of a man crouched, patient like she was. Another sniper. The irony didn't escape her. For a moment, she wondered if he saw her too. If they were two mirrors staring at each other across a desert, each waiting for the other to blink. He fired first. The crack echoed faintly, the round skipping off rock inches from her arm. She didn't flinch. Instead, she rolled left, recalculated, found the angle. He fired again, closer this time. The third shot would have found her, but she'd already moved. She caught the shimmer of his barrel through the heat wave, a faint ghost of steel. She aimed slightly low to counter the mirage. The world shrank again, breath, scope, stillness. The rifle bucked, the glint vanished. Dust settled, silence returned. She waited another full minute before exhaling. Then she whispered, too slow. Back at camp, her report was short. 1 hostile neutralized, ridge secure. The lieutenant looked at her like she'd walked out of a myth. That fast? It wasn't fast, she said. It was late. He didn't understand. He nodded anyway. The days that followed blurred together. Patrols went out. Intel came back thin. The desert remained indifferent, but something in the camp began to shift. Marines started asking for her opinion during briefs. Her name stopped being whispered like folklore and started being spoken like fact. At night, she'd sit near the perimeter, polishing her rifle, the stars like holes in a dark ceiling above her. Some of the younger soldiers would drift near, pretending to check gear, but really just wanting to listen. "Ma'am," one asked one evening, "how do you stay so calm when it starts?" She didn't look up. You stop trying to win, you start trying to measure. Measure what? Breath, distance, fear. Once you can measure it, it stops owning you. He nodded slowly, not sure he understood, but grateful anyway. When they left, she kept cleaning the weapon. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of fuel and cold metal. In that moment, she thought of her father again, of his hands steady on her shoulders, guiding her aim. Steady breath. Let the shot surprise you. She smiled faintly, a small flicker of warmth in a world too dry for tenderness. But even peace has shadows. One night, as the base settled into its mechanical rhythm, a call came over comms. A reconnaissance team pinned down 15 kilometers out, low on ammo, no visibility. Their support bird was grounded by weather. The lieutenant turned toward her without hesitation. "We can't reach them in time." Elena was already standing. "Then I will." He blinked. "You can't go alone." "I won't be alone," she said. "They're out there." He hesitated, saw the look in her eyes, and stopped arguing. An hour later, she was on the move again through the dark, guided by map memory and instinct. The moon was a sliver, the terrain a labyrinth of stone and shadow. She reached a high saddle overlooking the grid where the recon team's last signal had come. Through her scope, she saw faint muzzle flashes, enemy fire stitching the ground where silhouettes crawled for cover. She adjusted, breathed, and let the world slow to stillness. The first shot broke the rhythm of the ambush. The second silenced it. By the third, the valley was still again. Voices crackled faintly through the comms. "We're clear. Someone covering us." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. By dawn, she was back in camp, boots coated in dust, rifle slung low. The lieutenant was waiting. "Report." "Team safe. 3 hostiles down, no pursuit." He stared. "You walked 15 clicks in the dark and took out an ambush alone." She shrugged. Math works at night too. He let out a slow breath, half disbelief, half admiration. You're going to drive Command insane. Command already thinks I'm a myth, she said. Might as well live up to it. That day, as the sun rose high and the wind scattered the dust across the outpost, something settled inside her. Not peace, not pride, just balance. The kind that comes when a person finally stops waiting for permission to be what they already are. That evening, she opened her notebook and wrote one quiet line. You can't silence what was never loud to begin with. She closed the cover, leaned back against the crate and looked out over the horizon. The world ahead was still hostile, still broken, still demanding. But for the first time, it felt like something she could face without apology. Because Elena Marquez, Phantom 7, had learned the hardest truth of war. That sometimes, the most disciplined act of defiance is simply doing your duty when no one else dares to. And as the stars burned above Camp Relic, she realized the legend they'd built around her wasn't hers to own. It belonged to every quiet soldier who'd ever been told to wait and decided instead to act. They started painting her name on walls she had never seen. Phantom 7, the ghost who saved 480 men. The rumor crossed valleys faster than convoys. It slipped through radio chatter and supply chains, gathering new details every time someone retold it. Some said she had eyes like rifle glass, that she could see through sandstorms. Others said she wasn't real at all, just a story built from fear and hope. Elena Marquez didn't hear most of it firsthand. She caught fragments on the wind, a corporal saluting her in the chow line, a medic whispering thanks as she passed. Gratitude had a strange weight. It filled the air heavier than contempt ever had. At Camp Relic, her life folded into a rhythm again. Dawn briefings, range calibration, patrol reports, the ordinary machinery of war. But the quiet between those routines began to hum differently, like a generator running too hot. Wherever she walked, conversations bent around her. Commanders deferred, privates stiffened. Even silence saluted. One evening, she sat alone near the perimeter wall, watching heat shimmer off the rocks. Her notebook lay open on her knee, blank. The pencil hovered but refused to move. The pages before it were full of calculations and coordinates. This one wanted confession. She wasn't sure she had words for that. A shadow broke the light beside her. Lieutenant Raines, the young officer who'd first welcomed her to Relic, dropped to a crouch. Mind if I sit? She nodded once. He set down 2 tin cups, steam curling between them. Rumor is HQ's using your footage for training slides. The Marquez Doctrine, they're calling it. Her jaw tightened. Doctrine. Yeah, case study and initiative under pressure. He paused. You okay with that? She stared at the horizon until it blurred. Doctrine means rules. I broke them. Raines gave a small laugh. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe it is. She closed the notebook. Once they turn you into a story, they stop listening to the person inside it. He studied her face, searching for something softer than iron. You're still that person. She didn't answer. The desert did, a long gust carrying the smell of dust and fuel. A week later, a convoy arrived with fresh supplies and new faces. Among them were 2 war correspondents embedded for morale footage, cameras slung where rifles should be. They'd been cleared to interview the legend of Helmand. Elena wanted no part of it, but command insisted. Public morale, the colonel said over radio. They need a face for the story. So she stood under the blinding midday sun, while a reporter adjusted her mic and asked questions that had nothing to do with truth. How did it feel to save 480 Marines? She blinked against the glare. It felt like math. He frowned. Math. Angles, wind, distance. No fear. There's always fear. It just stops mattering when you start counting. The reporter smiled thinly, unsatisfied. Would you call yourself a hero? She looked past him to the horizon where the heat bent the air. Heroes get remembered. I just refuse to wait. The interview ran 2 weeks later on every military network. The clip looped endlessly, her face half in shadow, her voice calm, almost detached. Soldiers repeated her words like scripture, refused to wait. And slowly the myth grew teeth. Command began routing new recruits through Camp Relic for inspiration. They asked for autographs, for pictures beside her rifle. She refused them all. The requests became orders. Public image, the colonel reminded her again. Each time she complied, a little more distance opened between her and the silence she trusted. Then the orders changed. A high-risk operation, Operation Tailless Veil, deep into the mountain pass where 3 units had vanished weeks before. Recon believed insurgents had set up fortified ridges. HQ wanted Phantom 7 on Overwatch, not Sergeant Marquez if Phantom 7. When the briefing ended, she lingered. "Sir," she said quietly, "send another team. They need a scout, not a symbol." The colonel shook his head. "We need both. The men believe in you." Belief, she thought, was heavier than any pack. The insertion happened before dawn. The choppers moved under blackout, their blades slicing the thin mountain air. Elena sat beside Rains, gear strapped tight, eyes scanning the map projected on her lap. He leaned closer over the engine roar. "They say you can make the wind stop." She smirked faintly. "They say a lot of things." He hesitated then. "You nervous?" "Always. Nervous keeps you awake." The helicopter dropped into a shallow basin surrounded by jagged cliffs. The air was colder here, thinner. Her breath fogged against her visor. She took position on the western ridge, setting up her spotter scope. Below, squads fanned out through the valley floor, small figures swallowed by rock and silence. For hours, nothing. Then a flash, tiny, deliberate, near the northern slope. Her pulse steadied. She whispered into comms, eyes on movement, grid 317. Command confirmed, sent patrols. The mountains answered with gunfire. Rains's voice cracked through her headset. "We're pinned. Multiple contacts, high ridge." She adjusted, dialed wind, and fired. The shot clipped a machine gun barrel clean. Another lower, a silhouette toppling backward into dust. Through the static came voices, panic fading to coordination. Her rhythm returned, the same old metronome of precision. She could almost forget the cameras. But there were cameras. 2 of the correspondents had followed the patrol, their lenses glinting like targets. She saw one lift a drone controller. The device's LED blinked bright, a beacon to anyone watching. "Tell them to kill that feed," she hissed into comms. "They're broadcasting our position." Static, then nothing. A mortar shell landed 50 meters from the command element. The blast rolled up the ridge like thunder. Her headset filled with overlapping screams. She sighted the source, a team adjusting tubes on a shelf of rock. 3 bodies, 1 truck. Range, 1,100 meters. She took them in sequence, fast, surgical. The echo died. But when the smoke cleared, she saw movement near the correspondents. One was down. The other frozen, camera still running. Through the scope she could see his eyes wide, terrified, still recording. She wanted to shout, to tell him to drop it, to move. But the distance swallowed words. Another round hit near him, the blast throwing him into the dirt. The camera tumbled, lens cracking, feed dying. For a long moment, the battlefield fell silent except for the ringing in her ears. Rains's voice came faint. "Targets clear, casualty confirmed." She lowered the rifle slowly. "Copy." Later, after extraction, the official report would call it collateral during engagement. The footage, though, would survive. 15 seconds of her silhouette against the ridge, rifle flashing, followed by the blast that killed a journalist. It spread faster than truth ever could. Headlines bloomed. Phantom 7, hero or liability. Analysts argued tactics. Commentators debated morality. HQ issued statements about ongoing review. Back at camp, she said nothing. She sat by the wire as the sun bled into the sand, her rifle beside her knees, her hands motionless. Rains found her there. It wasn't your fault. It was my field, she said quietly. Everything inside it is my fault. He crouched beside her, lowering his voice. They're spinning it into propaganda. That reporter died filming a hero. That's what they'll sell. She looked at him, eyes dull with exhaustion. Then maybe the world deserves prettier lies. He didn't know how to answer that, so he just sat with her until the light faded completely. Weeks later, orders arrived again. No punishment, no commendation, just transfer papers reassigned to instructor duty back in the States. They wanted to bottle the legend, keep the person out of sight. The night before she left, she walked the perimeter one last time. The desert was quiet, wind brushing over sandbags like an exhale. She stopped at the highest point overlooking the valley and rested a hand on the rifle slung across her chest. Her father's dog tag tapped softly against the metal. "I didn't ask for any of this," she whispered, "but maybe you can't choose the weight, only how you carry it." In the distance, lightning flickered behind the mountains, silent but sure. She closed her eyes and let the afterglow paint her lids. When she boarded the transport the next morning, no one spoke. The Marines lined the runway in quiet respect, helmets tucked, hands raised. She didn't look back. Myths shouldn't wave goodbye. As the plane lifted, the desert shrank beneath her, a landscape carved by memory. Somewhere down there, the legend of Phantom 7 would keep walking, retold by men who needed to believe that courage was still real. But inside her chest, Elena Marquez carried a different story, one without cameras, without applause, without noise. Just the truth that had always guided her aim. Sometimes the shot isn't about ending something. It's about protecting what deserves to live. And as the clouds swallowed the desert, she closed her eyes and finally let herself sleep. Not the restless sleep of soldiers waiting for dawn, but the deep, dreamless kind that comes when the noise of the world finally fades to a single, steady breath. The air back home felt too clean. When the transport touched down on American soil, the first thing Elena noticed was the silence, not the silence of caution or distance, but the soft, ordinary kind that civilians never notice until they've lived without it. Birds, tires on asphalt, a breeze that didn't smell of dust or cordite. It should have been peace. It felt like exile. At Quantico, they gave her quarters overlooking the training range, a small apartment painted in the kind of government beige that swallows personality. Her orders were simple: instruct advanced marksmanship courses, debrief visiting units, consult on sniper doctrine. Nothing about Phantom 7. Nothing about Helmand. The legend had been boxed up somewhere higher than she could see. The first morning, she stood at the window watching recruits line up on the range. Their laughter carried across the field, bright and careless, like echoes from a world she no longer lived in. She wondered how many of them believed in the stories, the ghost sniper, the miracle valley. Probably all of them. When the instructor beside her cleared his throat, she realized she'd been starring too long. "They're waiting, ma'am." She stepped outside, the sun softer here but no less relentless. "Range time," she called. Her voice didn't carry authority so much as gravity. The recruits straightened instinctively. She moved among them as they fired, correcting stances, adjusting sights, her tone patient, deliberate. One private flinched at the recoil. She rested a hand on his shoulder. "Don't fight the rifle. Let it breathe with you." He nodded, tried again, steadier this time. When the session ended, a young corporal approached, helmet tucked under his arm. "Ma'am, is it true you hit 12 targets in under 3 minutes?" She wiped her hands on a rag. "No, it was 8, and it wasn't about speed." "What was it about?" "Necessity." He hesitated, unsure whether that was wisdom or warning. She didn't clarify. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of instruction replaced the rhythm of combat. Wake, train, debrief, sleep, or try to. At night she'd sit by the window, notebook open on her lap, pages blank. Out there in the dark, she could almost hear the wind from the Helmand Ridge whispering through the trees. Sometimes she'd dream of the valley, not the fighting, but the aftermath. The smoke rising in slow ribbons, the sound of rotor blades, the sudden quiet that follows chaos. She'd wake before dawn, drenched in sweat, reaching for a rifle that wasn't beside her anymore. She told no one. The myth didn't have nightmares. One afternoon, the base commander called her in. His office was lined with photographs of medals and smiling faces. "Marquez," he began, "I've had requests for you to appear at several events. Panels, interviews, recruitment promos." She stayed standing. "I'm an instructor, sir." "Exactly. You're the best example we have of what dedication can achieve." "I'm not an example, I'm a soldier." He exhaled, leaning back. "Public needs stories, Sergeant. They remember stories. The war's ending. We need people to believe in what it cost." She met his gaze evenly. "If they need belief, they can visit the memorial." He studied her, something like frustration under the formality. "You think you can disappear behind the range forever?" "I'm not hiding, sir. I'm recovering." That ended the conversation. But the invitations kept coming: talk shows, veteran foundations, even a proposal for a documentary. All declined. The myth had a name. The person beneath it refused to perform. By autumn, the range air grew colder. The recruits wrapped scarves under their collars, breaths visible as they aimed. Elena moved among them like a ghost herself, silent, precise, gentle when she had to be. One day a recruit froze mid-drill, staring at her. "Something wrong?" she asked. He lowered his rifle. "I read about you in school." "Then you read about someone else." "No, ma'am. Phantom 7. You saved my uncle's unit in Helmand." Her hands went still. "What's his name?" "Corporal Dustin Reeves." She remembered the name, scribbled in one of the casualty projections she'd ignored. He'd survived with shrapnel wounds. She swallowed. "He made it home." "Yes, ma'am. He said someone up there had his back." She nodded once, stepping aside. "Then that's enough." The recruit hesitated, then added softly, "He said to tell you thank you." When he walked away, she stared at the horizon until her eyes burned. Some debts were heavier than guilt. That night she visited the memorial wall near the main gate, black stone etched with too many names. The wind off the river bit cold against her skin. She traced a finger over one inscription she didn't recognize but felt connected to anyway. "They don't forget," she whispered. "They just keep adding." Behind her a voice said, "You talk to them often." She turned. The SEAL commander stood a few paces away, older, a few more scars, same steady eyes. "You found me." "Wasn't hard. You're the only ghost with a payroll number." She almost smiled. "What brings you here?" "Conference, doctrine updates. Thought I'd check if the legend still breathes." "Barely." He walked closer, hands in his pockets. "They tell me you turned down half of DC. They wanted sound bites. I don't have any left." He nodded, studying her face. "You still writing?" She looked down at the notebook she carried everywhere, thumb pressed against the worn spine. "Sometimes. It helps me remember what was real." They stood in silence for a while, watching the wind move across the stone. "You ever think about going back?" he asked quietly. "Every day, but the war's changing. Drones see farther than eyes now. Maybe there's no room left for patience." He shook his head. "There's always room for patience. Technology can't feel wind, can't read fear." She looked at him, something unspoken flickering between them, respect, shared weariness, maybe both. "You sound like my father." He smiled faintly. "He raised you well." When he left, she stayed long after, the memorial lights reflecting in her eyes like stars. The myth had drawn circles around her life, but here, among names that would never fade, she felt small enough to be human again. Winter came early. Snow along the range muted every sound, even gunfire. The recruits complained about cold fingers. She told them to listen to how quiet the world becomes when it's honest. "You'll never shoot cleaner than in still air," she said. "It forces you to hear yourself breathe." At night she'd walk the path to the range alone, the crunch of snow under her boots the only rhythm. She'd stop at the firing line, rest her palms on the cold metal and stare into the darkness. Sometimes she imagined the valley again, the same cold, the same silence, but this time without fear, just memory. One evening, Rains, now promoted, visiting for training, found her there. "You ever get tired of the ghosts?" he asked softly. She didn't turn. "They keep me honest." He stepped beside her, breath visible in the air. "Command wants to name a program after you. Long-range initiative, phantom protocol." She exhaled a slow breath. "Tell them no. They'll do it anyway." "I know." They stood quietly, the wind stirring snow across the line. "Why does it bother you so much?" he asked. She thought for a long time before answering. "Because they're building statues when they should be building memory. Statues forget how heavy the rifle felt." He nodded, not arguing. "Then teach them the weight." She glanced at him. "That's what I've been doing." Months passed. The range filled, emptied, filled again. Seasons changed. The world moved on from the war as it always did, leaving stories like dust behind. Yet sometimes, late at night, she'd get letters from Marines scattered across the country, short notes, unsigned, just words of thanks. "We made it home. You saved us. Your shots still echo when things get dark." She kept them in a small box under her bed. Not trophies, just reminders that accuracy could outlive applause. On her last evening before a scheduled reassignment to the Instructor Corps headquarters, she walked the length of the range one more time. The wind was soft, the sky painted with the pale fire of sunset. At the far end, she set her notebook on the bench and wrote a single line across its final page. "Sometimes silence isn't absence, it's respect." She tore out the page, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the box with the letters. Then she looked out at the empty field, the lines, the targets, the distant trees, and smiled faintly. She was still the same woman who had sat alone in Helmand, cleaning her rifle in the dust. The world had changed around her, built stories and doctrines and echoes. But she knew the truth. Courage doesn't fade when the war ends. It just changes uniform. The myth of Phantom 7 would live its own life now, retold in classrooms and films, polished and simplified until it sparkled. Let it. The real story didn't need retelling. It just needed remembering. She turned from the range, boots crunching in snow that had begun to fall again, soft, endless, clean. Behind her, the target stood untouched, rows of silent witnesses. And somewhere far away, in a desert that no longer burned, the wind moved through empty ridges, whispering her father's old words one last time. "Steady breath, let the shot surprise you." It started with a sound she hadn't heard in months. Helicopter blades, not distant, not passing, landing. The tremor rattled the windows of her small apartment above the training grounds, vibrating through her chest like a heartbeat she thought she'd forgotten. She set down her coffee and stepped to the window. Two black transport birds sat on the tarmac, engines idling. Men in dark uniforms stepped out, their movements too coordinated to be ordinary military protocol. Moments later, a knock. When she opened the door, a familiar face stood there, the SEAL commander, eyes harder than she remembered. "We need you," he said simply. She stared at him. "That line doesn't work anymore." "This isn't a request." He handed her a sealed folder. Inside, a map satellite overlay, red grids marked along a mountain range that made her stomach tighten. She recognized the terrain instantly. Not Helmand. Further north. Same war, different silence. "What happened?" she asked. "Recon bird went down 3 days ago. Classified cargo. We've had no extraction window since. Weather's killing drones. Local militias closing in." She glanced up. "And you think I can change the weather?" He didn't flinch. We need an overwatch who understands that ground, and one who doesn't panic when everything goes dark. She exhaled slowly. There are 100 shooters who can. They don't have your patience. For a long time, she said nothing. The bass hum of the choppers filled the silence between them. I'm not part of any unit anymore. He gave a small, sad smile. Phantom 7 never was. That night she sat on the edge of her bed, the folder open beside her. Old habits resurfaced, mental maps, approach angles, wind corridors. She wasn't afraid, but something in her chest felt heavier than it used to. Maybe it was knowing that peace never really holds when people still remember what you can do. At dawn, she suited up again. The uniform fit differently now, not tighter, not looser, just older. She paused at the mirror. No medals, no insignia beyond the name tag, just Marquez. She preferred it that way. The commander was waiting by the chopper. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded once. "I don't do ghosts halfway." The mountains rose beneath them like the bones of a sleeping god. Snow streaked the ridges, the valleys below washed in pale fog. The helicopter pitched in the thin air, engines whining in protest. Rains was there too, now promoted again, leading the small rescue detachment. "Never thought I'd see you back in the air," he shouted over the roar. "Neither did I," she replied. "Guess myths don't retire." She smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. Myths die harder than people. They touched down on a narrow plateau, wind whipping snow across their faces. The crash site lay 2 clicks north, signal faint but alive. The plan was simple. Elena would set up overwatch from the ridge while Raines's team descended into the basin to retrieve survivors. Simple, plans like that always were, until they were. She climbed alone, breath clouding in the cold, boots crunching against ice. The rifle slung across her back felt like memory itself, familiar, comforting, dangerous. At the crest, she lay flat, scope scanning the basin. Smoke curled faintly from the wreckage below. Movement 5, maybe 6 hostiles circling the site, 2 organized for scavengers. They were waiting for rescue. Through her comms, Raines's voice crackled. "Eyes. 6 tangos, high ground east. You've got a window 2 minutes before they shift." "Copy that." She settled into position, heartbeat sinking with her breath. The cold pressed into her bones, but her focus stayed sharp. She tracked the first target, wind low, humidity biting. She fired. The echo vanished into snow. The others scattered, returning fire toward the ridge. Rock chips sprayed her cheek, stinging. She didn't move. Another shot, another drop. Raines's team reached the wreckage. 2 survivors found, he said, breathing hard. "Extracting now." "Move faster," she murmured. "They're circling." She pivoted to cover their retreat, taking quick, efficient shots that cut through distance like whispers. Her world narrowed again, sound, aim, silence. Then static burst in her ear. "We're hit engine," the line fractured. Gunfire erupted below, louder, closer. Through her scope, she saw Raines's position, pinned behind debris, the evac route collapsing under incoming fire. She recalculated angles, but there were too many. The high ground to her left lit up with muzzle flashes she hadn't seen before. A secondary unit, they'd been baited. She switched frequencies. "Command, this is Phantom 7, request immediate air cover." Static, no answer. The storm rolling over the ridge was killing comms again. Of course it was. For a heartbeat, she felt the old dread, that precise, helpless silence that precedes every impossible choice. Then she breathed in, slow, steady. She slid from her nest and began to move down the slope, one hand on the rifle, one on the frozen rock. The wind screamed against her mask. She descended fast, using terrain as cover. Every instinct in her body protested, but instinct wasn't command. When she reached a lower ridge, she had line of sight on the advancing militia. Too close to the wreckage now. No time for careful range work. She dropped to one knee, exhaled, and fired 3 times in rhythm: left, right, center. The immediate advance folded. The survivors scrambled toward extraction ropes as the storm thickened, turning everything into a blur of white and motion. Raines's voice cracked through again, barely audible. "We've got them, 2 out, 1 wounded. Marquez, we're pulling." "Go," she said. "I'll cover until you're clear." "Negative, we're not leaving you." "You already have." She heard the confusion in his tone, but she was already moving, shifting position again, taking shots between gusts of snow. Every recoil felt heavier, every breath sharper. Her world shrank to rhythm. One more target, then another. Her last magazine ran dry just as the helicopters broke through the fog, dark silhouettes clawing against the wind. Raines's voice echoed faintly. "We're clear. Elena, get to the extraction line." She started toward it, slow at first, then faster, boots slipping on the slope. The ridge beneath her cracked with a sound like thunder. For an instant she froze, instinct screaming too late. The ledge gave way. She dropped 6 meters into powder and stone. Pain exploded through her shoulder. The rifle slid away, half buried in snow. She groaned, trying to rise, but her arm wouldn't move. Above, she could see the chopper hovering, searchlight sweeping. Raines shouting her name through comms. She reached for the radio, voice breaking. "Negative extraction. I'm below the ridge. You're out of time. Go." "Damn it, Elena." "Go." A long pause, then, "Copy, we'll come back." She smiled faintly. "Don't." The choppers lifted, fatting into the storm. The sound of the rotors dissolved into distance. Alone again. The snow thickened, falling around her like slow-burning ash. She leaned back against the rock, wincing. The cold numbed the pain quickly. Somewhere nearby, wind whispered across her rifle's barrel, the same low hum she'd heard in every silence before. She thought of all the faces she'd seen, the ones who lived because she had acted, the ones who didn't. The valley, the memorial, her father's voice, the quiet between shots. Maybe this was always how it was supposed to end. Not with glory, not with orders, but with the kind of stillness that demands nothing. She closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "Steady breath, let the shot surprise you." The storm swallowed the words whole. Hours later, the rescue team returned. They found her half buried in snow, pulse faint but alive. She had dragged herself back to her rifle, one hand resting on it, eyes open toward the horizon. The medic who reached her first would later swear he heard her murmuring something, not pain, not prayer, just a sentence repeated softly. "Duty is accuracy, not obedience." When she woke in the field hospital days later, Raines was there, bruised, exhausted, holding her dog Tag between his fingers. "You almost made me believe ghosts bleed," he said quietly. She smiled weakly. "That's the only way they stop haunting people." He nodded, eyes damp. "They're numbing the survivors' shelter after you." "Tell them not to." "Already done." She laughed once, a dry, soft sound. "Good." He leaned closer. "Why go back down that ridge? You could have stayed covered." She looked at him, voice barely above a whisper. "Because they were below me, and the rule is simple. You don't leave anyone below you." He said nothing, only nodded, understanding too much to speak. Months later, when she finally walked again, the military held a small ceremony. She attended in plain uniform, no medals displayed. When they called her name, she didn't stand. She just listened. The applause felt like wind, distant, fleeting. That night she walked alone along the coast near the hospital. The ocean moved endlessly, waves rising and falling like breath. She stopped at the edge of the pier, wind pulling her hair across her face. She thought of the desert, the mountains, the snow, all the places she'd left pieces of herself. She thought of silence, of noise, of the fine line between duty and defiance. And then she smiled, small, tired but real. Because she finally understood something her father had never needed to explain. That dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't beg for witness. It doesn't survive because the world remembers. It survives because when everything else fails, orders, myths, even faith, it still acts. She turned toward the horizon, watching the sun fade into the water. The air was still, heavy with salt and memory. "Steady breath," she whispered almost to herself. "Let the world surprise you." And for the first time in years, she did.